So welcome. Thank you all for coming. This is Data 101, an introduction to research data management. My name is Lisa Federer. I'm one of the health and life sciences librarians here, and I do a lot of work with researchers and helping them with their data. So I'm hoping to give you guys some knowledge and information that you can use to work better with your data or the data that you help people with. So what we're going to cover today, very briefly, I want to give you sort of a general overview of research data management best practices. Keep in mind that this is a huge topic. You could and can actually on this campus take quarter-long courses on this. So since we only have an hour, we're going to really just hit the highlights. Also, I know that you all come from different departments and the data that you're working with is probably very different. So we'll focus on things that are broadly applicable, and it's very likely that for your specific type of data that you work with, there are things that you might need to know additionally. But I will say that we are going to be offering a series of courses like this that are going to get into more depth in specific topics. So hopefully we'll cover some things that would be of relevance to you, and I'd really be interested in hearing from all of you about what kinds of topics you would like to see covered in future courses that would be relevant to the work that you do. So we're going to take a look at data management across the entire research data lifecycle, and I'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that means. And particularly, we're going to emphasize UC resources for data management. We're very lucky here at UCLA that we are part of a consortium of UC libraries that includes a group called the University of California Curation Center, or UC3. And a lot of what we're going to look at is resources that were developed at UC3 and are available for us to use here at UCLA, and really are incredible resources that we have. And then finally, I'll try to leave a lot of time at the end for your questions, because as I said, this is really going to be sort of a quick overview, and I want to make sure that there is time for you guys to ask questions that you might have related to your specific needs. That said, if you have any questions during the session, don't hesitate to stop and let me know if you have anything you'd like me to clarify. All right, sound good? Okay. So, why data management? I suspect that because you're here, I probably don't really have to tell you this. You probably know. But just to give you a brief overview of why this is important, for one thing, a lot of funders now require it. If you're going to be getting money from a funder, they want to know that you're going to be handling your data responsibly and that it's not just going to be collected, used once by you, and then tossed aside. They want to know that this data is going to have ongoing use for other researchers who might be able to benefit from it. Secondly, this makes it a lot easier for transitioning when there's lab staff turnover, especially in an academic institution like this. In a lot of labs, there are undergraduate students, graduate students who are working, and they're going to be in the lab for a short period of time, but they're eventually going to go and move on. And if they haven't, taken care to make sure that their data is well organized and managed, it's not really going to make a whole lot of sense for other people. So making a few sort of workflow ideas and taking a few steps to make sure that the data is well managed to start will ensure that other people that come into the project later will know what's going on. This also helps to better document research output. Again, particularly in an academic environment, it's very important to document what is the output of the research that you're doing, and to get credit for that for the academic work that you're doing. And so data management is part of that as well. Ensures the usefulness of data over its entire life cycle. There's often uses that other people will have for your data that you might not have anticipated. So making sure that all of your data is accurately collected and properly managed is going to give other people opportunities to make use of your data as well. And then finally, it facilitates data sharing. So in those cases that somebody else might benefit from or want to use your data, these sorts of practices will help make sure that it's something that makes sense for other people. So, as I mentioned, we're going to take the approach of looking at this from the point of view of the research data lifecycle. Now, there are many different models for envisioning this research data lifecycle, some of which become very complicated and have all these different parts shooting off. But this is a really simplistic version of it that we're going to look at today. So we start with planning for how we're going to handle our data. We move on to collecting the data. Then we have to think about managing the data. sharing it with other people, and then finally preservation for ensuring that the data remains useful long term. So we'll look at each of those steps and some of the resources that are available to assist you with working on each of those steps. So the first part is planning. This is a sort of an interesting step because now a lot of people are having to formally do planning in the form of a data management plan. Have any of you ever had to write a data management plan before? Okay, so just a few of you. If you work at all with grant funding, you probably will have to write a data management plan. Currently, data management plans are required by the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute of Museum and Library Studies, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, certain types of grants within the National Institutes of Health. So if you're getting any kind of grant funding at all, chances are good that your funder is going to want to see in your proposal some sort of data management plan. I've included links at the bottom for guidance on what NSF specifically requires, as well as what NIH requires. Right now, NIH only requires these sorts of plans for grants that are getting more than $500,000 in direct cost funding. So it may not apply to everybody, but I very strongly suspect that in the future, NIH will also start requiring this for all of their grant proposals. So what exactly is the data management plan? A lot of people have some misconceptions about exactly what should be included in that. So first off, having a data management plan does not require that all of your data must be shared. The grant funders are not saying you have to just give up all of this data that you've worked hard to collect. They do recognize that some data will be sensitive information, including data that might have privacy implications for patients. And they also recognize that people who collect data have certain intellectual property rights over the data that they've collected, and that there may be commercial value to the data that you may not want to go ahead and just give this away to everybody because this is something that you might want to be able to patent, make some money off of. And that is certainly acceptable to include in your data management plan, that you are not able to share the data completely freely for those reasons. They also recognize that sharing can take many forms. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that you can share data as we get into that sharing stage of the research data lifecycle. But there are lots of different ways you can do this. It doesn't necessarily have to be freely available to everybody. You can make certain restrictions about who you would like to share your data with, in what form you'd like to share your data, what method you'd like to do that. Funders also recognize that different disciplines have very different cultures of data sharing. Some disciplines, like the environmental sciences, are very open to sharing and have been doing this for a long time. Other fields, maybe not so much. Some fields really don't want to share their data at all. And so the funders recognize that the ways that people want to share data and the amount that they're willing to share is different depending on the field that they're in. And then finally, I'll emphasize that sharing is to be done at no more than incremental cost and within a reasonable time. So the reasonable time part means that you don't have to right away, as soon as you gather it, start sharing your data. If it's relevant to you, you might want to place some sort of an embargo period on your data. It's available 12 months after you publish. It's available after you've received a patent. Depending on what kind of issues you have with your data and your data needs, it's certainly acceptable to ask for a different period of time in which you would be able to share that data. And that comes from the National Science Foundation, though that sort of caveat is true for most of the funders that were required this kind of a data management plan. So any questions about any of that? Okay, so the probably most useful part of talking about the data management plan is where can you get help in writing this? Since only one of you raised your hand saying that you'd written one before, I assume if you were to have to write one today, you would probably not really know what to include, but fortunately there's a lot of resources for getting help. One of them is, of course, your library. So the librarians, myself and some of my other colleagues know about writing data management plans and can assist with what should be included. We also have a great resource that's available through the California Digital Library at UC3 called the DMP tool that I will demonstrate in a minute. That is an interactive tool that helps you to write your data management plan. It walks you through every step of the process depending on who your funder is, and even offers suggested text about what you should be including in the plan. I'm also including a link to DMP Online. This is a service from a UK group called the Digital Curation Center. So the funders that are included there are more of the overseas kind of funders, but it's another resource that's available in case that's something that would be relevant to you. So I want to briefly take a look at the DMP tool and show you how that works. So this was developed, as I said, by the University of California Curation Center, although this is something that is available freely to anybody who would like to use it. Since we have this sort of institutional relationship, we can actually log in using our UCLA logon. So I'm going to go to login in the corner, and you can select your institution. Again, these are the ones that are partners with the DMP tool, but this is something that anybody can use. So you'll select your institution, UCLA. The first time you log in, of course, you'll select that you're a new user. I'm a returning user, so I'm going to select that instead. And you'll log in just the way that you normally would to any UCLA resource with your BOL account. Whoops. Oh, you just saw part of my password. Okay, so when you log in, you can look at plans that you already have existing, or you can start to create a new one. And the first thing you need to do is figure out who your funder is, and within NSF, if you're doing that, which directorate you're using. So let's just take, for example, the chemistry division. So you'll give your plan a name. You'll want to include the number. And then these are just comments for you so you can refer back. This will not actually appear on your plan. And then once we get started, this particular directorate of NSF asks for 5 different sections within the data management plan. And we can click through each one, and it will tell us at the top basically what we're expected to include in each section. So here, the products of research, we're being asked to describe what the data is that we're collecting, some suggestions about questions that you might want to consider in answering this section. So we'll put some content here and then continue. And we'll go through each of these 5 steps. And again, it will ask us, what are the questions that we need to consider in this section. And some of them, you will see that we also have some additional help for UCLA, suggested text that you might want to include based on some of the resources that we have available here. So you'll go through all 5 steps, and we'll just put some stuff there. And when you get to the last step, after you hit save, you will get to a page where you can then export the content that you've just created. So you can do this as plain text or as a rich text format, which you can then open in Microsoft Word, make any changes if you need to. You can also get a PDF of the document from the preview button, which is back in our area where we're entering content. And that is the PDF. So it makes everything in the proper format, collects all of the information that you've entered, and basically spits out something that you can include right into your grant proposal document. So any questions about the DMP tool? Again, you can save these and come back to them. So under My Plans, I have all of the different plans that I've created. Currently, as far as I'm aware, there's not a mechanism for sharing, like if you're working with somebody on a DMP, there's not a way that you can actually share so you can both log in and be working on it. But these do create text documents that you can then go through and edit, so it's pretty simple to do. So, yes?
How often do they update? Do they check every time yearly to see if each foundation has a new?
Yeah, so the DMP tool is being continuously updated. In fact, they're adding new funders, and then when changes are made, they do make those updates to that. I will also point you to this tab here, the funder requirements. This collects all of the information that is sort of what's included in these individual help documents. So this outlines each of the funders that has that the DMP tool supports. You can get a template, you can get a link to their guidelines, and then in some cases there are actually examples of sample plans that you can take a look at. So an excellent resource if you're having to write a data management plan. Other questions? Okay. So that's the planning portion. So probably the most important part, I think, of doing this is having a good plan for what you want to do, because a lot of times people start thinking about preservation after they've already started collecting their data, and by then it's a little bit too late. So getting into the collection phase of data, I want to talk a little bit about best practices for data collection. This is the part that's especially probably going to be different for everybody, because the types of data you're collecting, I'm sure, are very different, the formats. But we'll talk briefly about some best practices that would apply to most people regardless of what type of data you're collecting. So first off, it's useful to consider what are some non-proprietary file formats that you could use for collecting your data, things that are open formats as opposed to closed formats. For example, as opposed to using a Microsoft doc file, it would be preferable to use a plain text or a rich text file. There are certain image types like PDF or PNG that are considered more open formats than something like BMP or TIFF. So just by the nature of some of the systems that people use, you can't always get open file formats, but when you have the option, it's better to use these non-proprietary file formats so that somebody who might want to use your data doesn't have to buy a special program to read it, and it's accessible to most people. Also consider future preservation and context of your data, not just what is needed right now. It's not always possible to know what somebody might eventually want to do with your data in the future, but it is useful to think about what other potential uses your data might have and collect data that would go along with that to help people figure out what you've collected. And a big part of that is collecting good metadata. So I want to talk a little bit more about what metadata is. Oh, there's a link also for additional information on open formats if you are trying to select a file format to choose. So the metadata portion of this is sort of on the collect and manage part of the data lifecycle. Metadata is data about data, essentially. This is information that's going to help contextualize the data that you've collected and allow somebody else to use it, and also give you more information about what you've done. So there are a few different types of metadata. Probably the most relevant and useful for what we're talking about is going to be descriptive metadata. This is information about how the data was collected, where the data was collected. So, on what date, at what time did I collect this information? What strength was I using on my laser? Any of these sorts of things that help to contextualize how I got this data. Technical metadata is more related to what file format it might be, to help somebody go back later that they would be able to access the document. Administrative metadata has to do with use and licensing, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So what you're allowing people to do with this data. Use metadata refers to basically sort of tracking who has used and edited the data. So if I'm working on a research team and there are 5 of us, it would be useful for me to know who was it that entered this particular piece of data. Was it me? Was it somebody else? And then finally, preservation metadata deals with long-term preservation and things like, do we have any sort of patient privacy issues that we have to think about with preservation? How long are we planning on preserving this? These sorts of questions. Many fields have existing metadata standards. So depending on what area you're doing research in, there might already be some sort of standard that you should be following in collecting metadata to go along with your data. For example, Miami, I think is how you pronounce it, stands for Minimum Information About a Microarray Experiment. So if you're doing work with microarrays, you should be collecting this type of data in order to share with other people, contextualize your data. Darwin Core is a standard for biology and biodiversity. There are many of these different types of standards available. There's a link at the bottom of this page to a list of examples of metadata standards. In the case that there is not an existing metadata standard for your field, librarians can usually help you figure out what kind of metadata you should be collecting. So that's something we can consult with you on if you have questions. And there also can be cases where if you're going to be sending something to a repository, that repository has requirements about what metadata they want included with the data that you send. So a tool that we have available to us as of very recently, this just came out I think at the beginning of October, to help with metadata and to help with collecting data in general is DataUp. So this is an add-in for Excel. It only works on the Windows version of Excel, and it has to be Excel 2007 or newer. But if you have a Mac or if you have an older version of Excel, there's also a web application that you can use, and it will do essentially the same thing. So there's 4 parts to what DataUp does for you. So the first part is that it checks your Excel file, your Excel document for best practices to ensure that it's meeting the criteria for what is considered best practices to send to a repository. For example, this is kind of small and I apologize, hopefully you can see it, but in this data set that I have here, it has pointed out 5 different problems with the data that I've included, such as I have got color coding, I've got special characters, I've got some cells that are blank. These are all things that I would want to go back and fix before I go and share this data set. The second part of what DataUp does is to help you create metadata. So there are 2 types of metadata that DataUp works with. There is the sort of document level metadata that talks about what exactly is this data set, who created it, when was it created, that sort of info. And then it also helps by walking you through each like column or row of your document and labeling what is in that and information about that. So for example, again, I don't know if you can see this so well, but in the box on the right, it's a list of all of the different data parts that have been collected and descriptions of what those are. So our field for temperature, are we collecting that in Celsius or Fahrenheit? Our field for pH, what is the acceptable range for something that could be included in that? So it helps you figure out what do I need to include to label this to make sure that somebody else would understand. So the next part of what DataUp does is it helps you to create a unique identifier and citation for if you would like to be able to cite this data. And we'll talk a little bit more about unique identifiers in a minute, but this allows you to share your data set with other people and also to get credit for that in forms of citation. And then there's not a pretty image to show, but the fourth part of what DataUp does is that it uploads automatically to repositories. Right now it only supports one repository, which is called OneShare, but they are looking at adding future repositories, so it would make it really easy for you to just with one click upload your data from Excel to a repository where then other people could access it. As I mentioned, oh, I'm sorry?
Is it free?
Totally free, yeah. So 2 ways to use it. The Excel add-in, which you can download, it's free, open source, again, only for Windows. The web application, also available freely for anyone to use. So it's really cool. It was developed at the UC3 center, but anybody can use it. So
when we upload it, we can share it with our team?
So yeah, when you upload using this particular service, this would be to an open repository that anybody would access. But I'll also talk a little bit more about some local resources that we have if you're just looking at sharing like maybe within a group. Other questions about any of this?
So anybody can get to it?
Yes, and this, if you choose to upload to this particular repository, it is open to the world to see. That may not be what you want, right, but there's other options for sharing as well. Other questions? Okay. So let's, since we're talking about sharing, move on to the sharing portion of our data lifecycle. So some best practices for data sharing. Again, keep in mind that different communities of practice have different ideas or cultures for how they share things. Some people use institutional repositories. We have at UCLA an institutional repository that is available to you. Some people use specialized subject repositories, and I'll show you how you can find repositories that would be relevant to your field or the type of data you collect. Some fields do more of person-to-person sharing of data. So I know that you are doing research in a field and I find it interesting and I would like to see your data set. So I email you, say, can I have that? And you email it to me. That is an acceptable method of data sharing. And if you wrote that in your DMP, that would be okay. A sort of new format of sharing data is in what's called data journals. So because of the fact that people have realized that it's sort of a problem that in terms of tenure and advancement, there's not really a good way of citing data that you've created, even though this is recognizable academic output. These data journals are basically places where you publicize your data. It's online, of course, completely electronic, but what you end up with is something that looks a lot like a journal citation, and it's something more like what people are used to seeing in tenure and promotion documents. So it's sort of a new way of getting credit and having a citation. Not a whole lot of fields have these journals yet. The only ones that I know of are like more in the geospatial and environmental kinds of areas, but I suspect that as sharing becomes more widespread, this kind of thing will increase. And it's also worth noting that data sharing is associated with increased citations. And if you're interested in finding more about that, there's a document that you can take a look at there. But the more people are willing to share their data, the more others are citing their work. So in terms of getting your work out there and being recognized, data sharing is certainly helpful. So we do have a couple of tools available through, again, UC3 that will assist you with sharing. EasyID is a service that allows you to create unique identifiers. So it's sort of like a URL for your data or your images or audio or whatever it might be, any sort of digital object, but it's something that's going to remain constant. So you can give somebody this identifier, and even if your stuff moves, that location gets updated and the identifier will always work. You may have heard of DOIs, digital object identifiers. This is an example of a type of unique identifier that you can get through EasyID. So usually you do have to pay to get a DOI. However, since we are part of this consortium, we subscribe to EasyID and we are able to get free identifiers. So if this is something that you'd be interested in getting an identifier for a data set or any sort of digital object that you have, we can certainly help you get set up with that. So another option or service that we have for sharing is Merit. This is a repository that is available to the UC community. This is the one service that I will talk about that is not free. You do have to pay for this one. But essentially it's sort of a cheaper version of cloud storage. So if you have something where you may be wanting to share with a research team that you're working with and it needs to be online, Merit is an option. If especially you're working with multi-institution research, you can use this as well, and other people at other institutions can share. You can also make your archives either private to just you or your team, or public to anybody. So it's sort of your choice how open you want to be with the data that you include in Merit. So any questions? I'm pretty sure it is. I would have to check on that, but if you made it public, I think that might be an issue, but if it's private, then yeah.
Does the UC recognize it as a HIPAA compliant data storage area?
I would have to check on that, but I believe so. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So another issue to think about with sharing is what you would like to have people be able to do with the data that you share. And one of the options for letting people know about what your policies are for reuse is Creative Commons licensing. So you may have heard of Creative Commons before. It's very popular on the internet, but it's also something that you can use to apply to data sets. And there are basically 6 different options. I've only included the 4 that I think are most relevant here. But you can go to their website for more info. And essentially this allows you to basically tell people what you would like them to be able to do with your data. The most open of the licenses is a CC BY license, which means that anybody can use your data, redistribute it, analyze it, tweak it, remix it, whatever they want to do with it, as long as they give you credit for it. And then the other versions allow you to, sort of say certain things that people can or can't do. Like the CC BY non-commercial means that, yes, you can do all that stuff with it, but you can't sell it to make money off of my data, even if you attribute it to me. Or there are things like the CC BY share alike, which mean that, yes, you can use my data and do stuff with it as long as you attribute it to me, but you also have to, with whatever product comes out of that, have a CC BY license as well. So the stuff that you do with it has to also be freely available. So if you're going to make data available and you want to make sure that people don't just like run off and do whatever with it, this is one option for letting people know about what requirements you'd like them to meet to use your data. So any questions about that? All right. So finally, we'll talk a little bit about preservation and planning for long-term preservation of your data. Your data's usefulness does not necessarily end when your research project ends. So it would be a shame to see your data just go away after your project is done. This is especially important for unique and non-replicable data sets. So something like, I have a data set about an earthquake and the seismic damage that occurred. Obviously, we cannot go back and recreate that earthquake. This is a one-time data set that we will never be able to gather again. So it's especially important that we preserve this for people who might want to use it later. Some options for long-term preservation include using institutional and subject-specialized repositories to preserve data. So something like Merit would be an option, or other repositories that might be relevant to your specific field. And one kind of term that I like to think about with preservation is this acronym LOCKS. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So you don't want to have just one copy of your data. I work with a lot of people that have these lab notebooks where they just write everything down and they don't make any copies of it and they don't digitize it, and it scares me because what if something happens, So you want to make sure that you have these different options for preservation so that if the worst occurs, you have not just lost 10, 15 years worth of data collection. You can also consider talking to the library about your data. One of the things that we've started to do in the library is think about whether we want to preserve data sets ourselves. So depending on what your data is, it may be that we would have a home for it in the library and we would be able to host it for you on a long-term basis. So if you're thinking about long-term preservation and you're not really sure where to put it, ask us about it and we might be able to offer you some assistance with that. So if you're looking for repositories where you can store your data, there are a couple of institutional repositories here at the University of California. Of course, there's Merit, which is more for the data itself. eScholarship I've also included, although it's slightly different. eScholarship is more of a place for publications. So it's sort of an open access publishing platform from the UC. So if you have, like an article that you've written and you'd like to make it open source, open access for people to get to, eScholarship is a free service that you can use for that. If you have NIH funding and you have to comply with the public access policy, you might also want to put your article in eScholarship in addition to putting it in PubMed Central as a way for more people to find it. eScholarship is also kind of nice because you can track who is reading, well, not who is, but how many people are reading your paper, so you can kind of see what's the impact of the document that you've put in. There are also tons and tons of subject-specific repositories. And because of the fact that I know we have a lot of different people in the room who are from different areas, I'm not going to focus too much on specific repositories, but I will give you a couple of resources that you can use to find repositories in your field. So the first one, DataBib. This is a brand new service. I think it started maybe 5 or 6 months ago. And it's basically just a searchable list of repositories in every different field, not just the sciences, humanities, social sciences. So if you are looking for data to use yourself, if you'd like to see if there are other people who have collected data that might be relevant to you, you can search to find if such a data set might exist. And you can also use it to find a repository where you might want to put your data. DataCite is an organization that is dedicated to promoting data citation. So the kind of thing that I've talked about with data journals and getting people to cite data sets, that's what they're all about. So they also have collected a list of repositories that are available for hosting data. And then finally, there's a list of open access directory data repositories that, again, lots of different fields. You can search to find something that might be relevant to the research that you're doing. So any questions about any of that? Okay. So as I've said, this has been a very broad, very brief overview of just a few of the options that are available for data management. And it's very likely that the specific needs that you have are going to be a little bit different from some of the stuff that we've talked about. So fortunately, there are lots of ways for you to get additional help with questions that you might have about this. First off, we have a fantastic data management guide that was put together by our excellent biomedical library intern, Vu Nguyen, who's here. So hats off to her for that. It's a great resource with lots and lots of information about data management and each of the aspects of the data lifecycle that we've talked about. We've talked a lot about the University of California Curation Center, UC3, that provides all of those excellent services for us, and their website is listed there as well. They have several different blogs where they write about what's going on at UC3, issues with data management. So if it's something you're interested in, they have some useful stuff for you to check out. And you can also feel free to contact a librarian. We are happy to help with data questions that you might have or questions in general. So I've given you 4 email addresses here that can be of use to you. The first one is for any sort of general data question you might have, just the data@library.ucla.edu. That's monitored by several different librarians who all have expertise in working with data, so we can help you figure out questions that you might have. If you have questions about copyright or licensing, so if you are thinking about sharing a data set, or even if you have questions about, you're getting ready to publish an article and you, want help with a copyright agreement or anything like that, we do have a division within the UCLA library for scholarly communications and licensing. So they have a help forum that you can get to on their website, and they will answer questions there. If you have general biomedical library questions, we have a reference email that you can send questions to, and that will be directed to the librarian who could best answer your question. So even if it's not a data question, if you just have a reference question about anything biomedical library related. Same thing for science and engineering library. If you're more in that field, they have a reference email as well where you can reach them. And finally, I'll take questions now, and you can also feel free to contact me directly if you have questions about anything we've talked about or questions about your data. So, what questions do you guys have? Yes?
Where can I find more information about HIPAA requirements related to data?
HIPAA requirements related to data you could probably find on, I believe they have some information about that on the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research page and the Office of Contracts and Grant Administration. I will look for some specific information and add that to the library subject guide that I've given you the URL for. Other questions? Yes?
So is the DMP kind of an upfront tool where you do it right at the start, or is it kind of an ongoing thing that lives throughout the life of your project?
So the actual implementation of your plan may progress as your project moves on, but the data management plan is something that's required when you send off your proposal for funding. So when you're actually asking NSF or NIH or whoever for grant funding, you have to tell them what your plans are for what you intend to do with your data. And they want to see that you have some sort of plan in place for handling preservation and all these sorts of things. Now, whether you end up doing exactly what you said, maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe you change your mind, maybe you find a better option, but the DMP itself actually has to go with the proposal. Other questions? Yeah.
Follow up to that one.
Yes.
Is that, so after the proposal, in the reporting requirements
Mm-hmm.
for the different agencies, are they starting to build in reporting requirements of how you're meeting your DMP objectives?
As far as I'm aware right now, no. The DMP requirement from NSF is very new. They just started it in January 2011, I believe. So right now, I will honestly say that there's not a whole lot of teeth behind this policy. They want to see that you're doing it. They want to see that you're thinking about it. But I have talked to people who have been on panels for NSF grants, and it's sort of like they just want to check the box and know that it's there. But again, I strongly suspect that as time goes on and this becomes a little bit more common, that they are going to start requiring that you, actually meet those things. Plus, you can ask for funding for, if you say that you're going to put stuff in the Merit repository and it's going to cost, however much a year, you can ask for funding for that as part of your proposal. So in that case, if you ask for funding for it, then yes, you would have to report on what you've done with that portion of the funding. Does that make sense? Other questions? Yeah.
I'm specifically interested in electronic lab notebooks, and I don't know if there's any tool or recommended.
Yeah, so the electronic lab notebooks is something that we sort of have our eye on and we are working on developing. We have a postdoctoral fellow here in the Biomedical Library who is very interested in that. She is offering classes on electronic lab notebook management, and if you're interested in having something like that for yourself or your group, let me know and I can put you in touch with her. But I think that that is something that we would like to develop in the future, but not yet. So there are a few options for things that kind of function like an electronic lab notebook. Like we have REDCap at UCLA, which is sort of an online electronic lab notebook, and also sort of a survey/data collection tool. So if you're interested in something like that, we can talk more about what that is. Other questions? All right, well, I will go ahead and distribute, if you don't mind passing this out, a handout that has links to several of the resources that we've talked about. Things that are available from the University of California, a couple of links to information resources about, like what does NSF ask for their data management plan, all of the contact info for the various different library people is on there as well. I will also be sending out the PowerPoint slides to everyone that registered for the class, so make sure that you have signed in so that you get the PowerPoints. And we've also been recording the class, so if you want to refer back to it later, or if you have colleagues that weren't able to make it, we'll have that available on the website eventually as well.
Are there follow-up lectures to this?
Yeah, so as I said, this is sort of the general overview, but I am working on planning a series of classes, and I would really love to have your feedback on what kind of classes would be the most relevant to you. I have a data class survey that I've been collecting information from. I'll send out the link to that as well in the follow-up email if you are interested in letting us know what you'd like to have classes on. But I am, again, working on planning a series. I think there will be classes that happen in this time frame, 12 to noon, and they'll cover more specific topics, like we'll have a class on the data up tool, we'll have a class on data management planning tool, things like advanced Excel options, textual analysis, those sorts of things. So yeah, all of that, and I'm very, very interested in hearing about what would be most useful for people on campus. So, other questions? Yeah.
In terms of like the whole field of like data collection and keeping it in a repository, are you starting to see people putting it into their list of references and like say faculty adding it to their CVs and things like that?
Yeah, so this is sort of something that librarians and data people are really trying to encourage faculty to do. We want to see people be able to get credit for the data that they're sharing and that they're creating. The typical sort of model of tenure and promotion is that people get credit for research publications. But it's sort of a change in culture that we would like to see people get credit for sharing data as well. So if you're working with faculty or if you are faculty, this is something that, yes, you should definitely consider including on your CV, on whatever documents that you have related to that, absolutely. And some of the stuff like the Easy ID gives you a citation that makes it a little bit more like something that would normally appear on a CV document. Any other questions? All right, well, I thank you all for coming. I will send out an email with all of this information as well as a follow-up post-test. If you took the pre-test, that would be super helpful if you could take the post-test as well to help us assess the usefulness of the course, and again, think about where we would like to offer future workshops and courses to be of use to you. So we'll end there. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you.